Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the November EALTA webinar. People are just logging on at the moment, so we'll just give people a couple of minutes to settle in and get tuned in. So thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I'll give you a little bit of background information about the webinar while we're waiting. As you know, this is in our series of EALTA webinars. We generally have about 3 or 4 a year on topics of interest to the language assessment community. The topics we've had so far have been based on the interests of EALTA members, and we've had previous webinars with Norman Verhelst, Sathina Chang, Jamie Dunley, Thomas Eckes. Our last topic with Thomas was on multifaceted rash measurement. Today's topic is a little bit different. It's going to be about using the companion volume of the CEFR. I'll introduce myself and the speaker today. My name is Richard Spivey, and I'm the webinar coordinator for EALTA. I'm a test development researcher at the British Council and a long-time EALTA member, and a regular attender of conferences and Sig meetings. And if you've been to any EALTA events, I'm sure you're familiar with our speaker today, Neus Figueras. Today, the duration of the talk is going to be about 50 minutes, 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll have some questions. You can use the Q&A function at any time during the webinar to log in your questions, and I'll answer a selection of them at the end. Other requests or issues that you may have, please use the chat function if you want to introduce yourself, or you want to ask any question about the running of the webinar. Please use the chat function for that. The technology seems to be working okay today, but please forgive any technical issues that we may have, and bear with us during this hour. So, our speaker today, the title of the talk is Revisiting, as you can see, Revisiting the CEFR Manual for Relating Exams with the CEFR Companion Volume. And our speaker today really doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll introduce her anyway. Neus Figueras started her career as teacher of English and coordinated the development of foreign language curricula and certificate examinations for adult learners in the Regional Ministry of Education in Catalonia, Spain for over 20 years. She's been involved in a number of international research and development projects related to assessment at different levels. For example, Dialang, Speakeasy, CEFR, among many others, and has given courses, given presentations, and done consultancy work in assessment in Spain, all around Europe, and in Asia and the USA. She collaborates regularly with the Council of Europe in the uses and dissemination of the CEFR in testing and assessment, and is one of the authors of the Manual for Relating Examinations to the CEFR. She's a founding member of EALTA, and last but not least, she was the first president, remember, of the association. And she's currently the coordinator of the EALTA CEFR SIG. Neus, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'll hand over to you now to begin when you want.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and welcome to what I think is the 6th webinar. I'll be talking, as Richard said, about the CEFR companion volume with new descriptors published in September last year, and also about the effect that this document has in the use of the Manual for Relating Exams to the CEFR. My main objective is, on the one hand, to highlight the importance of a thorough understanding of the document to prevent unwanted reactions we observed when the CEFR was published. I think it is very important to have a full understanding of what the companion volume has to offer before embarking on using it, perhaps too rashly. On the other hand, I'll draw on some of the issues already raised in relation to users in language testing of the companion volume and describe some of the challenges the document presents for users. I will try and finally point towards a possible way forward into incorporating the companion volume and the manual. This is the outline of my session. I think that I will get started with a brief overview of the context where the companion volume has been published. The CEFR gathered a lot of information in 20 years around it. And there is now an apparatus around the CEFR that has broadened the vision we had about it from what was its initial focus, foreign languages, into the languages in school, the languages of schooling, regional minority languages, etc. And all these initiatives and documentation has been included in what the Council of Europe refers to as the platform of resources and references for plurilingual and intercultural education. I think that it is important to take this into consideration because, in fact, this broad approach to how the CEFR is used is very relevant, I think, to how we understand the companion volume. A lot has happened in 20 years in the field of language learning and teaching, but also in language assessment, and most specifically in language testing. If we think of language testing in Europe in 2001, and we think of language testing in Europe today, we think that there's been a huge progress in terms of quality and transparency. There's an increased network of professionals who collaborate and communicate all the time. And there's also intensive research and a lot of documentation available. In 2001, EALTA did not exist. CERCLES, which is the European Association of Language Testers at University, did not exist. ALTE was the only organization visible, and it was much smaller and had less impact than it has today. So a lot has happened in the field of language testing in Europe with the publication of the Manual for Relating Exams, the Manual for Language Test Development, the development and the growth of what the Council of Europe refers to as the toolbox, where you can find exemplars of tasks related to the CEFR, exemplars of students talking, speaking in different languages, scored in relation to the CEFR, etc., etc. So, in fact, the companion volume is welcome in a quite broad apparatus of information, documentation, etc. The companion volume then responds officially, and this is what the, let me check the name of the titles of Professor Bergen and Keriadze, the head of education department and the head of the education policy in the Council of Europe, in the foreword to the companion volume, highlight this idea of a broad approach, not only concerning foreign languages, but also the languages of schooling, and also that the additions do not impact the construct initially described in the CFR. On the one hand, we have this foreword in the companion volume, which is the administrative political perspective, but also it is very much present in the academic perspective, as described by Brian North, for example, in the launch of the companion volume in Strasbourg last May, where he outlined the purpose of the companion volume: completing the descriptive scheme, operationalizing the scheme for activities which were not properly described or fully described in the CFR, also including one of the very important projects that the Council of Europe has been involved in, the sign language. There was updating of the CFR scales and adding new scales, but also what is very important and ties in with what I've been discussing in terms of the broad approach is that there's an insistence on the need to reinforce the message of the CFR: learning, teaching, assessment. There's certain worry that the CFR has been perhaps more implemented by testers and more fully implemented by testers than in classrooms or in classroom assessment. So the idea is that the focus of the companion volume goes beyond the focus that we thought initially the CFR was about. It's not only the companion volume, of course, takes on board some of the criticisms that the CFR received and tries to tackle them. It also tries to update some of the scales in relation to what has been happening over 20 years. 20 years ago, and even more, because the first draft of the CFR was circulated in 1996. There's many more C2 speakers today than they were in the late 1990s. So that's why in the companion volume, there's also more C2 descriptors. So in this context, the companion volume is also in itself part of a wider apparatus, which includes, because these documents I'm going to show you have been published along the companion volume. We have the collated samples of descriptors for young learners, and there's 2 volumes, one volume for ages 7 to 10, one volume for ages 11 to 15. There's also an impressive document, a theoretical document on the mediation function of schools by Danielle Coste and Marisa Cavalli, which is at the background of the new scales for mediation. And there's also already reports on how the illustrative descriptors were developed, and the phonological scale was reviewed. So in September 2017, we see the publication of the manual, of the companion volume. We had seen some months ago the publication of Marisa Cavalli and Danielle Coste's volume, and we also see the publication of reports on development of the companion volume and also additional collation of descriptors. So it's just published, but it already has quite an accompanying number of documents. The way that the companion volume is structured, in fact, respects what I've just been saying. There's a preface and a foreword to complete the administrative and political perspective. There's a main section with an introduction to the companion volume, why it is published and how this came about. And in this section, there's 3 subsections. one on the key aspects of the CFR for teaching and learning, which is useful in order to remind ourselves of what the CFR was meant to mean for us. There's a full description of the project, and then the illustrative descriptor scales follow. Not only the new ones, but the old ones, I mean the 2000 ones with new descriptors. And as with the CFR, there's a very important section in the appendices. I can't remember now, I think there's 10 or something like that appendices, which include the updates of the main tables in the CFR, incorporating new descriptors and new scales, summaries, and suggestions on users of the different new scales in the different domains in Table 5 in the CFR, etc., etc. I think that the companion volume is a dense document, but on the other hand, it includes very clear and explicit information and detail, which I think is worth referring to. You will all remember, if you've sort of, browsed over the companion volume, you'll remember this very helpful graphical representations of how the different levels grow. There's also a very interesting rendering of a graph that got lost in between the draft publication of the CFR in 1996 and the final publication in 2001, which is highlighted in the companion volume, not only to remind us of what mediation means and where it stands, but also to remind us that the CFR never meant to insist on a 4-skill division or a 5-skill division, but on 4 modes of communication which are related. So this is a way of approaching the companion volume, looking at the first section where a reminder of what the CFR means, I think is very useful. Then there's a very clear number of illustrations on the new descriptors, the updates, the additions, etc. There's also a very useful table showing how the document came about, what validation procedures were followed, and this graph is fully developed in one of the documents I have already mentioned, the one on the development of the new descriptors. Then this good summaries of the changes. Table 5, for example, includes a comprehensive list of what is new. There's pre-A1 descriptors, there's changes to the descriptors in 2001, there's changes in other descriptors, there's an increased number of plus levels, there's mediation, there's plurilingual, etc., etc., etc. If you want to consult this, you can find it in Table 5 in the companion volume. It is useful to take into consideration that the companion volume tries to make life easy for us in using color coding. So if you print it in black and white, you may not be able to appreciate how, for example, the new descriptors in the old scales are in black, the existing descriptors are in blue, the new descriptors are in black, and the old 2001 scales are shown with a blue background, whereas the new scales are shown in a different color. I think it is orange. So there's an obvious will to try and make things easy for those who are willing to do a good job and read the companion volume before using it. This is highlighted because, in fact, this is one of the changes I'm going to refer to, and which comes up in the appendix. Understanding conversation between other speakers used to be understanding conversation between native speakers. This is one of the substantial changes that have been made into the descriptors. There's a number of new scales. There's new scales related to activities, ordinary activities, reading and speaking. There's a number of new scales on mediation, which seems to be the star. Everybody's talking about the new mediation scales. And there's a number of scales on plurilingual and pluricultural competence. In total, there's 35 new scales, 24 of which are for mediation. So there's quite a lot to read and understand. It's not only the scales, but it's the text in the first sections that I mentioned to you that takes you by the hand and to the scales. This is the overview of the mediation scales, mediation activities and mediation strategies, and the outline of the 3 plurilingual and pluricultural competence scales. I'll deal a bit more on mediation, and then I'll go on to language testing. Mediation was already present in the 21 CFR. There were activities outlined for oral mediation, written mediation, and there were proposals for mediation strategies, planning, execution, evaluation, and repair. There were no scales developed for these, although they actually can be, these characteristics can be seen in many of the scales for mediation that have just been published. There's a number of changes. There's no reference to interpretation in order to avoid clashes with the professional field, and translation is limited to informal translation. But in fact, what the CFR said in 4.4 is very much in the new scales. The other aspect in the new scales for mediation has to do with the Costa-Cavalli document that I have already mentioned, and the 3 poles of tension, as it were, that a language learner as a social agent normally has to contend with. Learning through mobility, either in school or in any other social context within the community, and encountering different types of otherness, he or she needs to cope with either by means of language mediation or cognitive mediation or relational mediation. This idea has been incorporated in the description of the new descriptors, and this is how they are described in the companion volume. Mediation refers to the learner as a social agent, a concept already in the CFR, and the focus is on the role of language in a variety of processes in different contexts: social, pedagogic, cultural, linguistic, or pedagogic. So it's quite a broad focus that may or may not be relevant for many of us language testers. It may be very relevant in the languages of schooling. It may be very relevant in CLIL classes, but it may not be relevant for some language testers who have a target audience that may not need what is described in the mediation or the plurilingual and pluricultural scales. So this is a summary of the mediation descriptors for you to have a look at. Mediating a text and mediation strategies are both what we used to think of mediation would be like, and whereas mediating concepts and mediating communication is rather different. So again, it is something to take into consideration in relation to what may or may not be relevant for us. This is an example of one of the appendices in the companion volume. The native speaker has been got rid of, and also absolute statements. In fact, this is a response to some of the criticisms and comments that the CEFR received. The native speaker is no longer a model, and absolute statements tended to be far too absolute. So this was also changed. Let's go and see what we know so far about the companion volume. There's a lot of work that has already been documented. The black titles have to do with familiarization or dissemination activities that aim at a wider knowledge of the companion volume, whereas the blue ones are the ones that include elements that are relevant for us testers. I will focus mainly on issues raised in the EALTA Dublin CEFR Sig, some of the issues raised in the presentation by Vincent Fourny at the Strasbourg meeting in May 2018, and two examples of uses of the companion volume in language tests by people who already started using it. I have not included here because it is not directly related to the work within the companion volume, although it is tangential. This pioneer work done in Greece by the KPG, they've been working and using mediation activities interlanguage and intralanguage for a number of years, and you might want to check their website because you might find interesting examples of use of mediation. Let's go then to explore what problems, challenges, issues, difficulties we find in using the manual for relating examinations to the CEFR, which was published in its final version in 2009, and the companion volume. As you know, the manual was published to go with the CEFR. If we want to use the manual now, we'll need to relate it not only to the CEFR, but also to the companion volume. Let's have a look at the issues that were raised that might be relevant for testers in the meeting, the Sig meeting we held in Dublin last January. Oh, January this year, yes. The idea was to convene a number of professionals to present position papers and have reactions and discussion on different aspects of the three main blocks in the companion volume. We talked about the updates, we talked about mediation, and we talked about plurilingual and pluricultural scales. I'll briefly outline the issues that were raised in relation to each of the three blocks. If we look at the issues related to the updates, sorry, can you see something wrong? Wait a minute. I think it's frozen. I don't know if Richard is around.
I don't know. We can just see updates in the corner of the slide now, so I don't know what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Strange. Shall I do it again?
Yeah, maybe exit and
yeah.
Start again, perhaps.
Very strange. I tried it out before, and shall I do new function? I think. Wait a minute. Okay, well, at least people will have time to breathe now. Sorry, I've been going so fast. Very strange.
Okay, while Neus is kind of dealing with this, let me just mention that at the end of the session today, we've got a survey that we would like you to fill in, and I'm going to provide the link to the survey. It's a SurveyMonkey survey, and I'll put it in the chat section. So just before the end of the talk today, I'll put the link in there. It's about a dozen questions, and it should take you probably about 2 minutes to fill out. So, okay, we seem to be...
Okay, seems to work. Sorry about that.
Okay.
At least I've given you 2 seconds to breathe. Sorry, I was going very fast. In relation to updates, there were a number of comments, and I'll just have a look. On the one hand, it seems that the companion volume is welcome. It's a vast improvement. There's more descriptors per level, a wider spectrum is described, and some of the sort of gaps that were observed in the CEFR have been filled, although there's still a number of too long descriptors. And when you start using the new scales and even the 2001 scales with new descriptors, you'll find that there's many, many more descriptors that you would like to have to cope with. In fact, there's an embarrassment of riches, and we'll have to learn how to pick and choose. There were complaints about no scientific report. There's a report on how the document was developed, the mediation scales, but there's no figures yet available, no statistical data. And some people felt that the companion volume included perhaps too much of the CFR, and people would be in doubt whether to use the companion volume and forget about the CFR. So that would be a possible problem. Another, it seems to happen, the same thing happened. Wait a minute, I'll do it again. Sorry about that. Then the descriptors still have a lot of room for improvement, and there's a lot of wording that when doing the familiarization sessions we felt were inconsistent, so this is still there. There are questions that have to do with how the new scales outside the mediation and the plurilingual scales can be used. And also there's substantial changes in scales like processing text, which was in reading, but now is part of mediation scales. As for mediation, there were basically 3 reactions. Why should we use mediation? What is the actual use of the test? How is mediation relevant to the target use domain? And what decisions do we need to make that require mediation tasks? How can mediation be implemented? Different relations between different languages is going to be different. It's not the same to mediate from French into Spanish or to mediate from English into Spanish. So this is going to be a source of possible research. Applying the mediation scales was found that it would be difficult. How far are educational systems ready to employ and sustain mediation? We're talking about classroom assessment, teachers, but also how to reconcile the need to talk and teach and learn about mediation in the classroom and how this relates to the need to test it. What kind of accommodations and conditions need to be in place for mediation scale descriptors to be implemented successfully? Does cross-linguistic mediation raise fairness concerns? This content comparability across forms. We're assessing non-linguistic competence. And also, how far can we flesh out the difference or the relevance of contrasting situational authenticity with interactional authenticity in test tasks? So the discussion on mediation raised a number of issues that perhaps we should think of researching into quite seriously before rashly embarking into using descriptors in tests that will mean making decisions on people. Something similar happened with the plurilingual and the pluricultural scales. They were perceived that they would be difficult to apply in standardized examinations because we measure language competence and we need reliability, and testing plurilingual and pluricultural goes a bit beyond that. Plurilingual scales will definitely be very useful in bilingual or CLIL programs for vocational purposes, for airports, in hospitals, etc., but not everywhere. And also an issue was raised about the real meaning of pluricultural, because the word culture is mentioned a lot in the CFR and in the companion volume, but there's no strong definition of culture. The bottom line of the discussion on the plurilingual and pluricultural scales was that this will raise issues in relation to how to take a different view on observation, assessment, and measurement. We can assess a number of descriptors, but we may not be able to measure them. In the launch in Strasbourg, I just put up this slide because I think it is useful to have a look at the title of the launch meeting. The title of the meeting was Building Inclusive Societies Through Enriching Plurilingual and Pluricultural Education. So this ties in with the broad aspect that I referred to at the beginning of the session. There were 12 presentations. You can access them on the web. Only one talks about the implications for assessment. And this is what Vincent Fourny had to say on mediation. I've translated it from the French. I'm not going to read that for you, but I think that I would go for the third statement. From the point of view of measurement of competences in standardized tests, it is advisable to be cautious and to accept that mediation challenges the limits of language measurement. Another, I think, relevant session took place in Bochum, the CFR SIG, where Cristina Rodriguez and Olga Lankina shared with us how they have been using mediation descriptors in speaking tests in their context, and their presentations will be soon available on the EALTA website. EALTA, I've checked what's going on in Europe. EALTA introduced the companion volume in their SIG in April. There's a session in the upcoming SIG in November in Salamanca by Ms. Lovek from Norway. And we'll see how this develops, and we'll be in touch with EALTA to see how they organize the discussions around the uses of the companion volume. So, summary of issues and challenges. The first one is, what is the status of the document? The document was published as a provisional version, but now it is referred to as a final version. So we need to know whether there's room for incorporating feedback that comes from using the document or not. There's translations in preparation. The French translation is already, I think, ready. The German and the Spanish translation are almost there. We'll see how we can use those translations and how we can manage to incorporate any relevant changes into translations, but that's another issue. Will the companion volume manage to reverse the unintended consequences of the CFR and excessive focus on exams? Is there any need for accompanying documentation that can be used in training? The very useful framed reminders in the CFR at the end of each section, the boxed texts in italics. Is there a need for a notes for users? The companion volume opens up a way, very welcomely, ways of assessing beyond the 4 skills, which means that it asks for a reconceptualization of language tests and how to test. What is the construct that we are assessing if we're incorporating mediation and the pluricultural and the plurilingual? So testers will need to get their act together and decide on what aspects are worth exploring, why, and how. And I would suggest, humbly, but I think that that could be a good start, thinking of dimensions like this is immediately useful or this is not that useful. For example, the new phonology scale, some of the new descriptors, they can contribute to improve existing tests, and existing marking schemes. And these can be of immediate use without too much difficulty. There's another collection of dimensions, of descriptors and novelties, which may be perceived more relevant for certain contexts than in others. For example, the use of pre-A1 descriptors for some exam boards, or the use of new descriptors. Some may be very relevant. For example, if there's an exam or a test that has integrated tasks, new descriptors on mediation can be very, very useful in describing these tasks much more finely. This, however, has to do with how easy these changes can be implemented. Is it straightforward, less straightforward? It is just a change in a test, in a marking scheme, in the specifications. Does it mean that there's a change in the linking procedures because we have to prepare familiarization activities for the new descriptors? Is there a change in the completion of manual forms, which will have to be slightly amended? Or is there a change, do we need a new form in the manual that contemplates the use of certain descriptors? I'll have a look at some examples now. In any case, there seems to be a movement towards a higher local relevance, which will challenge common understanding and demand for transparency. And this transparency asks for evidence, and a good, well-researched system will have its consequences. So we're facing quite a complex situation that goes beyond, oh, I like this descriptor, I'm going to use it for this and that and the other. It's not only that we like it or we find it very useful or very relevant, it's how we're going to implement it and how we're going to document it. I'll have a look at a couple of examples. My 2 questions are how to go about familiarization, standardization, and benchmarking as described in the manual in relation with using the companion volume, and how to use the forms. Should the manual be revisited? How Why? When? By whom? If we look at table 5.5 in the manual, which has been used by many of us, standardization, training, and benchmarking, we'll need to update, for example, the documents to use because these documents have been updated in appendices 1 and 2 in the companion volume. If we look at the spoken interaction form, there's reference to table 5 in 4.1, there's reference to some lists in 4.4.2.1 and 4.4.3.1, but these references have been, as it were, modified by the companion volume, which has in Appendix 6 examples of use in different domains, which will help the old 4.1 in the CFR. It has also expanded on the purposes of cumulative tasks, as described in 4.3. There's almost no change in the oral reception listening activities, although there's additional text, which is very useful and should perhaps be incorporated into specifications. And then there's a number of changes and new descriptors in the subscales for spoken interaction referred to in 4.4.3.1. We can see that there's a change in the title, in understanding an interlocutor. There's new descriptors in conversation, new descriptors in informal discussion, new descriptors in formal discussion, etc., etc. It has to be remembered that some of the descriptors may not be very relevant. This is an absolute numbers. They may not be relevant for our case, but in any case, we need to read and think whether they are worth using or not, and why and how. Another example, this Form A15 on integrated skills. All the headings that you can see here on integrated skills, on possible combinations, will need to be redrafted because we're not talking about reading and spoken production. We talk about translating a written text in speech or relaying specific information in speech, etc., etc., etc. I'm not going to deal too long on this. You can have a look at the PowerPoint slides when they are uploaded, but also any attempt at using the manual forms with the CFR on your left and the companion volume on your right will show you issues like this and situations like this. I'm not saying that this is a terrible problem, but this is something that needs to be addressed. And the same will happen with forms A16 on integrated skills or A17 on spoken mediation. So what's the summary and what's the possible outlook? There's a number of open questions in the use of the companion volume, language testing and assessment. The first one, of course, is how can the companion volume be used sensibly? What can be done to make it fully accessible and understood? How will the companion volume and the CFR coexist? Are we going to use both? What page numbers are we going to write down in our manual forms? The CFR, the companion volume, the two? Are we going to use different colors? What are we going to do? What are the implications of the companion volume in the linking procedures, not completing the forms only, which is the specification phase? I'm talking about the familiarization, I'm talking about standardization. There's a number of spoken exemplars, written scripts, listening and reading items that have been used with standardization that may need to be revisited. And then, while we do all this, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. What mechanisms can we put in place to collect feedback and data for institutions engaged in high-stakes assessment? That's why, with Richard, we put together that the survey that he's already referred to, we really would like to listen to read what you have to say about the uses of the companion volume in high stakes assessment. And this will contribute to putting together a research agenda and deciding on an approximate timeline. We need to remember that the CFR was circulated for 4 years before its final publication in 2001. Remember that in 2002, all exam boards seemed to have already linked their exams to the CFR. And after the publication of the manual pilot version in 2003, we started to see some studies, and only more than 15 years later, we can think that we've got a good grasp of what it means to relate an exam to the CFR. So I think that we need to be modest and cautious. And please, what do you think? And complete the survey. We really want your feedback, and we will try and make sure that we pursue the work that you suggest, and in the next CFR SIG, and perhaps a special event that the EALTA CFR SIG will organize in the near future. So here's some of the bibliography I think is crucial for you to have a look at. And thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your questions and to your opinions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neus.
Sorry, I've been too fast. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. That was great. Thank you. That's been very informative, and I think we understand what a kind of significant volume this companion volume is now. The full weight of the new volume. So now we come to question and answers. Please use the Q&A function to send in any questions that you would like to be answered, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. Also, please check the link that I've put into the chat section. You can just click on that or copy and paste it into your browser, and please it'll only take you 2 minutes to fill in the survey, so please do that straight after.
Yes, please do, yes.
This is finished, because it will contribute to, as Neus said, the research agenda, and will, give us some ideas to start work on. So over to questions. One question here from someone called Richard, who asks, is there any guidance or documentation on translating the descriptors into rating scales? He says that he has some trouble just looking through some of the scales, maybe with some of the language which is used there, doesn't seem to be particularly suitable to scaling on rating scales. Mm-hmm. So how can we do that?
This is an issue that was raised with the CFR scales. There's a number of projects that worked on how to make descriptors more easily understood. I remember, for example, when you do familiarization exercises, what's the difference between you can read a text, you can understand the text? Is reading more than understanding, or is understanding more than reading? I think that the crucial thing here is to look at the full descriptor and not only focus on the initial verb, but in the rest of the descriptor, which actually, I think one of the pieces of work that I found very useful was what we did for Dialang, which is breaking down the descriptors into what you can do, how well you can do it, under which conditions and limitations, which is, I think, in Appendix 2 of the CFR. There's also research made on descriptor development by Felianka Kaftandieva. She presented this in the Krakow EALTA conference. You can find it in the resources webpage in EALTA. And I'm sure that she published this elsewhere. The problem is that you have to operationalize descriptors into rating scales, because descriptors were not meant to be a curriculum or teaching objectives or a scale. The descriptors are the definition of what can be observed in a person at this level. The other problem I can see, and Richard has not perhaps worded it yet, but I'm sure that he's aware of this, is that in many levels, I can't remember which one now, in many scales, we used to have 3 descriptors. Now we have 6 descriptors, which is going to ask for operationalization, but also collapsing descriptors and then empirically validating the rating scale using the same procedures that have been used for validating the new descriptors. In any case, when I was referring to the difference between a provisional version and a final version, I was thinking that the CFR descriptors were published alongside Brian North's PhD, which had data. I think that Brian has this data. I suppose that he's putting it together now to be published. I'm sure that this data can be available soon, and this will help us see which descriptors seem to be more reliable than others.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, Richard, I hope that answers your question or gives you some ideas. I've got another question here from Maggie, who says, do you find the linking studies that try to link a single part or skill of a test to the CEFR meaningful? For example, linking the writing section of TOEFL to the CEFR. Is that a meaningful activity?
Yeah, I don't know in what, I mean, I thought that the TOEFL had linked all its sections to the CFR. I think that ideally you should link all your sections to the CFR, but there's always a way to begin. I will always remember the insistence of the Council of Europe head when we were working on the manual. Joe Shields insisted on the importance of having a manual that would be useful for a small operation in Moldova, and also for a big organization like Cambridge. And that's why the manual that we devised has 3 distinct sections that go from first specify what your exam is doing in relation to the CFR, then do standardization and standard setting, and then do validation. I think that as long as we know where we're heading, we should get started and start at the beginning, and the beginning is familiarization. Everybody who's been through the linking process claims that familiarization is key, and we cannot rashly embark on doing anything without knowing fully well what we're doing.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. I hope that was useful. Looking through other questions, I have one more question here at the moment. Question from Payman says, do you think that the companion manual is helping to change standardized testing to be based more on students' language abilities rather than their test-taking abilities?
Oof. This is a testing question. I think that the companion volume will force testers to revisit the construct. I think that, and this is something that came up in Dublin, the discussion of what is the construct. And I think that a number of existing high-stakes tests do test students' ability. There's always in the world good tests and less good tests, and some tests are better at assessing students' ability than others. In any case, I think that I wouldn't say it's fair on most of the existing high-stakes tests today that they mainly assess students' test-taking abilities. I think that it has changed. I think that, for example, when I was working with Sauli Takala a couple of years ago in putting together the tasks to illustrate how to assess listening and reading, the response we got from exam boards had nothing to do with the response we had got 15 years ago. A lot of people in Europe and outside Europe are doing a very decent job. They sent us not only their specifications, their exams, their data, their reports. I think that on the whole, people are working very hard. Of course, there's always exceptions, but I think that we've made a huge leap in Europe as compared with, I mean, when we published the manual in 2003, in Europe, we were very, very low on standard setting, whereas all the literature was in the USA. And I think that this has changed.
Okay. Thanks for that, Neus. Maybe just got time for one or two more questions. We have a question from Mackie here, who asks, how do you think that mediation will be integrated into examinations? Or will it be integrated into examinations?
That's why I sort of bored you with all the information already available, like, for example, the 2 small informal presentations in the EALTA Sig in Bochum. If you write to me, I can send them to you. I'll ask for the permission of the speakers because they have not been uploaded yet. But these 2 ladies had sat, scrutinized their existing test, and looked at the descriptors for mediation to see what descriptors were already reflected in their test so that they could include them in the specifications, and what descriptors they found would be very useful in their test to capture better the students' ability, which were not there. So I think there's a lot of small-scale studies that are now taking place and that can be very useful to see what mediation scales are relevant. I think, for example, that for integrated tasks, a lot of the mediation scales will be relevant. For many speaking activities, a lot of mediation scales will be relevant immediately, and the same for writing scripts. But it may be a bit more difficult to try and incorporate, I don't know, conceptual mediation. But I think that one step after another. Let's start with what is useful or immediately useful, and then see what is relevant and very relevant, and then see how straightforward 1 and 2 are, and then start doing it. But I think that from scratch, we need to start documenting it so that what I do in my context, what I do in my CLIL context in Barcelona is clear for me, of course, but can also be clear to somebody doing CLIL in Paris who wants to see how I'm doing it. I think this is the way forward.
Okay.
Less is more. Start at the beginning modestly.
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, do we have any more questions? Well, I have one of my own, actually, while I was listening to you, just maybe a last question. This is still quite new to a lot of people. A lot of people may still not be familiar with the companion volume yet. With the addition of all these new descriptors, new scales, is there any, do you think there's any risk that we're kind of diluting the CEFR at all? I mean, one of the great things about the great successes of the CEFR is that it really has brought people together and get people talking the same language. Now we've introduced a lot of new things, and people, as you say, people will pick and choose what they need. Is there a chance that we might be getting fragmented? Or is that just my reaction because I'm still a little bit overwhelmed by all the new material? What do you think?
I mean, this is a worry that I personally had from the very beginning, thinking of how rashly people embarked in talking about the CFR without having read it properly. Only perhaps a lot of people knew about the CFR having read only Table 1, and everybody now is talking about mediation, and there's been no attempt at reading in depth the chapter on key issues. That's one thing. I see the same danger that you see, Richard, and this is one of the questions I had at the end of my presentation. What's the status of what's the status of the companion volume? Is this a final version or not? And the second one is, what's the relationship between document 1 and document 2 going to be? If somebody is using the manual and changes slightly some of the forms to be able to use the updated tables in the companion volume, does this institution need to refer to page whatever table 1 CFR and page whatever table, same table in the companion volume? This needs to be highlighted because I suppose that the easy way out is to say updated table companion volume. But the companion volume captures a lot of the essence in the CFR and the descriptors, and all the descriptors, they're all there. But there's sections there and there's text there that is not in the companion volume. And then maybe the companion volume means that it accompanies. For example, in Spanish, it's been translated as complementario, which is it complements. So if the complement becomes the document, then what do we do with the blue book?
Yeah.
So this is an issue, definitely. That's maybe this is a philosophical question, but it's a question that may look less practical, but which is very relevant.
No, I'm sure this is, yes, this companion volume is going to keep us busy for quite
a while.
Minutes, I think.
So take it easy, there's no hurry.
Yes. Okay, well, I'd just like to say I need to wrap things up now, but I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today.
Yes, thank you.
Of course, especially thank you to Neus for a very fascinating and informative talk. I think we all learned quite a lot today. If you have any feedback about today's session, you can send to me by email, but again, please fill in the survey, the link that I've sent to you, and there's a feedback section in there. We would love to hear what you think. Our next EALTA webinar, I think it will be in the spring, topic to be confirmed. If you have any suggestions, please send them to me. The recording of this webinar and a PDF of the slides, I hope, will go up into the resources section of the EALTA website as soon as we can possibly do that. I think we'll sign off now. Thank you again to everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Neus.
Complete the survey.
Complete the survey. Goodbye, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye, take care.